The sun is super up, Bitcoiners! And Bitcoin's running just fine. So all that's left to do is have a drink this morning. I got tea. I don't know what you have. And talk about what's new. Yeah, well, they were out of coffee cups. So I'm drinking my wife's. So life's great. Life is great. So, you know, sometimes it's nice to mob story from a different source. We get the Atlantic a lot. We're going to be talking the Atlantic a lot today. It's always like the Washington Post or MSNBC or CNN. That really fertile ground. But it's rare we can go into tech journalism to find some good fake news, right? We got one today, TechCrunch. Remember, the challenge before me is to find a head that doesn't require a punchline, right? So what do we got? TechCrunch has decided to go back on the Mr. Beast story and cover it again. And so here's their headline. Mr. Beast's blindness video puts systemic ableism on display. That Mr. Beast again. What's he up to? Jeez, helping the blind. Now, I have another one, and it's from The Atlantic, and that's what I said. We're going to be talking about The Atlantic a lot today. And this one could be construed as fake news, but we actually have to talk about it, right? I can't just offer the whole thing as humor. So The Atlantic, and I even read the article. I put myself through this. Could you imagine? I put myself through reading an Atlantical for you. For you. It's Saturday morning. I did it for you, Bitcoiners. Here's what it says. This is for real. It says, don't read his lips, right? It's about Jerome Powell, our favorite Fed chairperson. The article goes on to say that the better strategy for central bankers is to just explain clearly what they're thinking, writes James Surowicki, and give up on the idea that the right combination of words will move markets in the perfect direction, right? The perfect direction. So what's going on with this Atlantic article? So I read it, and they did a good job actually charting the history of Fed chairs and what they say and their dialogue and things like that. So it was a little useful, right? They go into some details about how for a long time you didn't even get press conferences from the Federal Reserve, right? It was all just mind reading and guessing and reading the tea leaves and those kinds of things. So we've talked about that before. Young, when Alan Greenspan spoke, literally the world stopped, right? It was so rare, and on the occasion that it happened, everyone paid attention, and then it reverberated. But in fact, the Atlantic goes into detail here and says, well, the big change in Fed communications came with Greenspan's successor, Ben Bernanke. Bernanke was a firm believer in transparency and open discourse as virtues in and of themselves, but he also thought, correctly, that if the Fed was clear about what it was trying to achieve with its policy, the markets would be more likely to respond to new financial data in a way that reinforced what the Fed wanted them to do. In 2011, Ben Bernanke held the first ever scheduled news conference by a Fed chair. The following year, he laid out for the first time an explicit low inflation policy benchmark. So this is sort of a new thing, right? It's a new thing that we wait and try to listen and divine what the secretary or the chair of the Federal Reserve is thinking. But here's the problem. What are we supposed to do if they're clear about stuff, right? They don't really get into those details. And what if they are now asked to actually say real things and not just persuasion, not just manipulation and those things? Like, what I mean by that is, what if they have to explain the financial system and their monetary policy decisions everyone could understand, or even economists could understand, right? Well, I think the answer becomes really clear. It leads us back to this world of experts. It leads us back to the down system that everyone amidst right now. So what it actually is saying, this article, is if the Fed chair does come out and have policy initiatives, well, then they're an active participant. And in the democratic system, believe it or not, right, they would have to become an active participant and not just this neutral, supposed independent institution. They would actually have to start coming out with real policy decisions, right? That's what this person is saying. They're saying, I am okay if the Federal Reserve is explicit and transparent about national policy issues and how they are connected to the monetary system. Right? even to the extent that they have these press conferences, they narrow the conversation just, oh, we want the overnight rate to be this. Oh, we think there needs to be more liquidity. It's soft. That's why they use such soft, amorphous language. Forcing them into a world where they have to use precise language will at once show that it's a bunch of voodoo from one, right, the whole economist world, but it would now clearly merge the worlds of politics and macroeconomics. Now, in my version of economics, there is no such thing as macroeconomics. There's economics, which is what has been called microeconomics, right? Which is the choices individuals make every day to spend their money on this or that. And what they call macroeconomics, which is politics. There's no such thing as macroeconomics. It's politics, right? It's politics. Remember, it's sort of ironic that Bitcoiners are obsessed with macroeconomics. That's a Keynesian thing, right? In no world do Austrian school people think in terms of macroeconomics. They understand it's politics. It's just politics. It's the same thing, right? Now, Bitcoin and the US dollar and everything that came before is something beyond politics called megapolitics in the sovereign individual. So the Martin Lutheranism with the of megapolitics, because it changed how we interacted with kings and feudal lords, and it changed how merchants operated. It changed everything, right? It had huge changes, huge implications for the church, for literacy, for the ability for people to understand under what conditions they were living. So now that they're actually explicitly saying they want the Fed chair to actively engage in policy, what are they actually saying? Well, they're saying what we all worry they're saying. They're saying it straight out, right? They're almost there. They're almost telling you you will live under an expert class prescriptive environment. It'll be pure top-down stuff, right? That's what I hear. Now, you think about that, right? The Atlantic is writing this, and everything we now know about Twitter files, everything we know about the same unelected folks, right, in the CIA and the FBI who are running psychological operations through mainstream media and social media, having an even more powerful role, right, an even more explicitly aligned role of top-down mechanics in order to run basically all policy in the country. So luckily, things are changing quickly, right? This whole top-down thing is getting smashed on every single side. Glenn Greenwald went full at the Atlantic yesterday, and here's what he was talking about. So I mentioned just now the Atlantic basically casting their vote for a Fed Reserve bank cartel domination of America. As long as they show their work, as long as they show that, don't worry. Let them just explain what they want and not try and suggest it. And if they just explain what they want, everything will be better, right? The markets will respond. Even though we live in an environment where the whole mega politics of Wall Street is to not fight the Fed. That's religion. That's religion on Wall Street. Take it from someone who spent a few years on Wall Street, right? That's how everyone talks, right? Don't fight the Fed. Go in that direction. That's why everyone is listening to what the Fed chair has to say, because of exactly what the Atlantic underlining here, the persuasive ability of the Federal Reserve and the policymakers at the Federal Reserve is the most important factor in our economic confidence or pessimism, right? So the whole thing is a marketing campaign, right? And we don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, right? Bitcoin also is supported by a marketing campaign of sorts, which is an organic distribution of people who are enthusiastic and motivated to help. There's no top down here. It's a bottom up situation, but it's a psychological commodity, right? Bitcoin is a psychological commodity, just like the US dollar. These are competing psychological commodities. And the psychology of each unit is what's the most, right? The psychology and the consistency of that psychology is what allows these things to perpetuate forward. So Glenn Greenwald, right? So we just heard from the Atlantic what they want. They want the top-down thing, right? Just tell it, just show us your work, right? Just a little more top-down, not enough, more explicit top-down. Luckily, Greenwald yesterday smashed the Atlantic because of this whole Seymour Hersh story, where he underlined the U.S. involvement with Nord Stream, right? So that's a big story right now. Everybody talking about it. So Glenn Greenwald yesterday underlined that any journalist, right? He really talks about the journalistic industry in America and how it works. And he underlined the system basically works like this, right? Glenn Greenwald explains how the journalist who lied America into the Iraq War became the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Journalists who see conspiracy theories get promoted, and journalists who question the CIA get destroyed. And he's, of course, talking about Mr. Jeffrey Goldberg. And he brought the old headlines. This one's from the New Yorker, and this is in the lead up to the Iraq War, saying the Great Terror in northern Iraq. There is more evidence of Saddam Hussein's genocidal war on the Kurds and of his possible ties to Al Qaeda. Now, remember, a lot of you know hallucinations were required in order to tie Saddam Hussein into Al Qaeda and 9/11. Right, a lot had to be injected into the scene to see that continuity, and that's why we had to imagine weapons of mass destruction, and why the journalistic entities that all participated in this same format of information distribution that Glenn Greenwald was talking about, why they participated in this thing and were able to generate these top-down headlines, right? In order to motivate Americans to war, they had to hallucinate a bunch of things that just weren't there, including weapons of mass destruction. We saw the information laundering system out in the open around the Iraq War, which was an unnamed source, right? That's the same old tactic. An unnamed source says, and then they cite the article that cites the unnamed source, and then suddenly they have something that looks like a direct citation, right? So once you abstract at one level, once you have the Washington Post quote an unnamed source, and then some other newspaper like USA Today quoting the Washington Post story, it's like you have a credible piece of information, even though everything was built off of dust. There's nothing really there. Unnamed source, which is how all of this information ends up getting laundered, right? So information laundering is the system. That is the operating system. That's how this thing works. And Glenn Greenwald says whoever understands that better are the ones who are promoted. So this guy, Jeffrey Goldberg, was the one who explicitly said several times and made the case to the American people that Al Qaeda and 9/11 were connected to Saddam Hussein, and therefore we needed to go as the country and mop up what was going on in Iraq, because otherwise, other skyscrapers in America, that was going to be obviously not a good thing. So Glenn Greer underlines exactly how the system works, right? But it's not quite enough that we know, right? We understand that people's minds don't really get changed just from seeing hypocrisy eyes, right? I can show you a few examples, right? We've got this story yesterday on Anna Polina Luna. And if you remember who she was the person who was involved in the Twitter and Homeland Security stuff. Sorry, the Twitter and the political censorship stuff that has been exposed in Congress over the past couple of days. There have been hearings. Yoel Roth was part of it, and Luna was one of the people who got Yoel Roth up against the wall and had some viral moments around, and he did the moronic up talk. I don't know what's going on, right? If we don't do it, we'll have real problems, right? So she smacked him around and was really assertive, and of course, seeing a Latin woman who was really that targeted, that dangerous, I suppose you could say, to official narrative, right? Having someone like that, what do we expect would happen in this information laundering system of ours? Well, of course, yesterday there was an attack all over. Washington Post claimed that because she says she has some Jewish ancestry. No. She's actually a Nazi, they said. And they said she was a registered Democrat just a few years ago, right? So they had to issue a retraction right away within one day because the article was so crazy. This is from the Washington Post, right? So right away they had to issue an apology for what they said because true. So here's the article called "The Making of Anna Polina Luna," and in the article, written by Jacqueline Alamany, they go was registered as a Washington state in 2017 based on an erroneous Washington only requires voters declare party affiliation when they cast a ballot in the POTUS primary. So sorry for the error, right? So they call her all these names, and then it's so sorry for the error. So, this stuff's going on every day, and pointing it out is never going to be enough. Now, I checked on Twitter. A bunch of people did not see the retraction. Obviously, everyone going on, oh, she's the child of a Nazi, and all of these things, right? So obviously, it doesn't make a difference when you point this stuff out, right? So just pointing out hypocrisy, just pointing out examples of it happening, probably won't be enough. But the good news is, it looks like things are getting pushed to a point where the mega politics of it are starting to come out, which are those forces that are not really intellectual and are not really about using logic to make decisions, but people being forced into a position to make a choice and having to choose between one way and who you listen to, and another is what's coming for a lot of people. One of them are the Catholic folks, right? So all of a sudden, Catholics getting targeted by the same FBI system because of, wait for it, an article written by The Atlantic just last year about how the rosary has become an extremist symbol. That was the headline. The rosary, how the rosary became an extremist symbol. And this was published just back in September, right? And because of that, last August, because last August, The Atlantic itself labeled the rosary as an extremist symbol, the FBI cited the article and used that as an excuse to target Catholics with the same kind of surveillance that they have, Bitcoiners and MAGA people and everybody else, right? So all of a sudden, right, they're moving the whole machine into places where it hasn't necessarily gone before. So you had a lot of Catholics that I think by nature, let's be honest, Catholics by nature have a top-down worldview, right? It's different for a Catholic to deny the top-down nature of the world and reality that they live in, simply because that is a foundation of Catholicism. Those were the mega politics that were engaged by Martin Luther 500 years ago, right? They still haven't totally worked through the system, right? They still have not totally worked through the system. So Catholics all of a sudden being targeted by this is one of the ways you start breaking more people out, right? This is not a logic argument. This is just forcing people to live in a condition they're not going to be happy with. It's like forcing people to live in poverty. Some will just accept it. They'll say, oh, no big deal, right? No big deal. But the battle lines change and you get more and more people that fall on one side or the other when these kinds of new battle fronts are opened, like on the Catholic Church in this, right? So by the Atlantic labeling the rosary as a white supremacist symbol, of course they're going to be capturing people they did not intend, and that would have otherwise probably been on their side. And here's another proof of just how hard it is to penetrate these two fields and why mega political forces like money are required to shift the battlefront in a psychological operations game like World War III is becoming more and more like. So here's something that's been going on yesterday, which was Ida Bay Wells, right? Ida Bay Wells, Nicole Hannah Jones, who always writes under the name Ida Bay Wells. Nicole Hannah Jones being the writer of I can't remember the year, the thing they gave a Pulitzer to, a real foundation of America, 1660 something, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, awful stuff and completely fake news, and in some respects has become kind of a joke, has made the Pulitzer itself a joke, right? Not that it's the only case of a Pulitzer being given to people who wrote fiction and an award for writing news. But in this case, she still has never had to face any ramifications of the complete fiction of the book that won the Pulitzer. So here's what she said about Thomas Sowell. If you guys don't know who Thomas Sowell is, he's a Columbia University professor of economics and an original Bitcoiner, in a sense. He is a person who has been talking about this top-down structure and about bottom-up culture and the tensions between them for quite a long time. He is probably the greatest living American economist, not the kind that Jerome Powell is, not the kind that is sitting here offering prescriptions on the overnight interest rates, the kind who can see it in historical contexts from a long, long time ago. And so Nicole Hannah Jones asks, right, other than being black, what exactly is Sowell's expertise in slavery or history? So Thomas Sowell has written, multiple books on race, slavery, history, all cited many times. And someone like Nicole Hannah Jones simply can't even see it. I imagine that's what we're dealing with. This is a person who, hey, despite fiction writing and Pulitzer, she still has a, high performing, high caliber brain, right? And I don't think she's evil. I don't at all think she's someone who's out there wanting a world of racial strife. Now, there's a point why she may, because everyone who benefits from a system certainly doesn't want to see the system go away. And if you get paid to grift on problems, well, you'll rationalize it because that's exactly what we're talking about here. Right? These aren't logical things. You use logic after you've made the choice in order to make the choice make sense to you. So that's because I'm getting paid for it and life is good. And nothing against Nicole Hannah whatsoever, right? The world has allowed for this to happen. She's benefiting from it. And to me, all's fair when that stuff comes. But the mega politics are what would change someone like Nicole Hannah Jones's mind, but we're not quite there, right? We're not quite there. So she'll probably stay for, one of the last people to be, to fall on the effects of the mega political struggle that's going on around us in World War III. So, but what will change people's mind, right? What are the other mega political forces going on? And that's where we start to see that what Bitcoin is offering can really be that mega political force to end World War III in the same way that an atomic bomb was a mega political force that ended World War II, right? Can't argue with an atomic bomb in 1948, right? Like, right, powerful. And in the same way, Bitcoin offers a power force that isn't really up for debate, right? Here, we're not selling democracy in Bitcoin, right? We're not selling democracy. We're selling freedom is a way individuals practice their lives. It's not something you get from voting for a political party. In fact, voting for a political party is likely going to restrict your freedom, right? Likely going to restrict your freedom or someone else's freedom, right? So the myth that we're living in, that the democratic process and democratic institutions are the things that bring you freedom, right? And you can see history that way if you go back to the early dawn of America. But hold on a second, right? The American system from the start really just allowed people to practice their own freedom on the land, right? And that didn't change until World War II, and we had this huge bureaucracy, and now the capacity to have information laundering and psychological operations and institutions, the Federal Reserve, and all of these other top-down structures, where they start making this case that, well, actually, the freedoms can only be gained through us, right? We deliver those to you. We created an infrastructure that won a war, and that war freedom which we gave to you, and so that became sort of foundational to American understanding of freedom, and subverted our old understanding of freedom, which came from an even more ancient form of probably as far back as the Germanic tribes, where they sort of lived free, right? The same way Native Americans lived free until that was ended, right, by imperial forces that came. But in that sense, it was live off the land and marry who you fall in love with, and that sort of is my impression of what was going on in these early tribes, right, in Germany and in North America. So the mega political forces that are changing this top-down structure aren't just limited to the way people read the news and the way people can identify information laundering. It's coming from having to see now that we're fighting a war, and in Ukraine, right, with the Biden crime family and everything that's going on around that we've got these struggles, and at the same time, right, you get now all the AGs, I think 19 AGs, right, not all, but 19 attorneys general Plus, the Virginia Attorney General sent a memo to the FBI saying that the FBI cease and desist spying on law-abiding citizens, all details relating to illegal surveillance, and they're considering possible legal action. So now, here's one of the brilliant things that are happening, which we've predicted on the show, that American federalism, right, that the ability of all of these states to renegotiate with USA Inc. in Washington, D.C., and the entire federal apparatus is going to give America the dexterity required, right? And this comes down to that same how you practice freedom thing. And because America can scale down to the state level, and because there are states that will always give Americans much more proximity to democratic institutions, which can then be used against other democratic institutions to change things, right? You get all these states now who are going to come out and start fighting the US government and all of the institutions that were built around World War II in order to continue to have this top-down structure from Washington, D.C., like the FBI, like the CIA. So the states starting to get back some of their sovereignty and not being collected into this federal entity. You had Rand Paul yesterday, right? Rand Paul, who I think is now, the more I look at it, probably has the Battle of World War III accurately perceived of any person in the U.S. Congress. That's where I'm at with him, right? I think he sees the battlefront on really accurately. You know, it helps who his dad was. One can only imagine he'll be talking about Bitcoin when a time is right. Right, one can only imagine. I've met his father a few times at Bitcoin shows. Right, he likes to come to Bitcoin shows, and he's been around the Bitcoin world for over 10 years now. Ron Paul, his father. So yesterday he was trying to expose U.S. funding of the biolabs, which we've been talking about for a few days here in Ukraine, in Taiwan, and in other places. And he was one of the first people to bring that up, and about how that is probably related and should be discussed at a much wider level. So all of a sudden, right, this top-down structure that relies so heavily on just like work, relies so heavily on manipulation, a more language, the real binary, and were we involved in gain of function or not? Right? It's more and more like America was heavily involved in gain of function and had a massive role to play in the creation of COVID in the first place. He was exposing all kinds of dialogue between Stanford and the Wuhan, how multiple American entities complained about the procedures and processes over in Wuhan while they were funding this research. And now this is going to force everyone into these wars. The PSYOP machine can move, right? It can only move so quickly in all of these leaks. And we're getting beyond the point of just logic and reason. We're getting into the mega political aspect of things. And because we're getting into the mega politics, more people who are able to see, well, you know, if they lied about this, the function thing, well, how much of the rest of it was true? How much of the rest of our protocols and procedures to deal with the gain of function were in our best interest, or were really to mitigate what was going on with the virus? Now, we don't actually have to prove this, right? We don't have to prove it. What's happening in places like Canada, places like Brazil, you know, some of the losers in COVID, right? Some of the places where we saw in Canada anyway, the most explicit acceptance at a high percentage, let's say, a high percentage of people in Canada accepted everything the government had to say and just said, well, they're always in our best interest. I'd say Canada has some of the lowest IQ of any of the so-called rich countries, because they probably have the percentage of people who just blindly trust the government. I mean, I think that. I think Canada, Australia, New Zealand has some of the highest percentage of people that trust their government, because in general, their government is slightly more competent because of the scale of the country. Small countries, right? They're not like the United States. They're all very small. And because these countries are very small, they sort of have a proximity to the top-down structure that makes them feel a little more comfortable, maybe. I don't know the reasons, right? But I've seen it my whole life. Canadians, much more trusting of their government than almost any people in the world, and very naive about it, right? Not everyone in Canada, but a high percentage, right? So what now is Justin Trudeau has made it explicit that all health transfers, so Canada is also a federation, except the federal government has a lot more taxation power than the provinces, and they can get the provinces to do things and pay them. So this creates a weird situation in Canada. Probably wasn't intended from the start, but that's the way things are. And what ends up happening is the states in Canada do have a lot of negotiating power. They certainly do have a lot of negotiating power. But one of the heavy, or one of the stronger pieces of leverage the federal government has is the transfer pay for healthcare, because healthcare is a state issue, and because all states have a socialized system, the bill is high. What I'm proposing is that unless states get with digital ID, right, which will have vax passports built in, health passports built in to go shopping, to go eating, the things all Canadians loved complying with during COVID. Unless a state has one of those, the federal government isn't going to give them their healthcare transfer. So basically, unless they adopt a system that most Canadians, I think, don't want to see instituted on a national level without a health emergency like a pandemic, most of them now are going to have to live with the system. The state of Alberta, the province of Alberta, has denied it. They have said to the federal government, "Don't want your money. Keep it. We're never against digital health passport." I can imagine a lot of Canadians moving there now just to get away from any health passport. That could definitely be the case. Are all the states going to listen? Who knows? But it's changing the lines. It's changing the debate. It's going to advance a bottom-up structure, because more people than not are going to be uninterested in this top-down thing. It's going to happen pretty much all over the country. Brazil is trying it too. Right, Brazil is trying it too. They're doing what we've predicted on this show for a long time is going to be the case: a UBI based on a health. And if you don't, not getting the UBI, Lula, the president of Brazil, has said, right, if you don't get the vaccine, you're not getting UBI, because they're going to be putting in a UBI system. Now, as a Bitcoiner, we look at all these people at the Atlantic, and we look at all these people at the Washington Post, and I have to admit, I believe in UBI, because I don't know what you're going to do with any of these journalists. I mean, they're such sludge people. Their brains are so broken. This Nicole Hannah-Jones, like I said, maybe, if the mega politics get strong enough, but what can she do beyond the grift? What is there for her to do beyond the grift? Right? And how many people are like that? She's super talented and smart. She could probably, she's a Pulitzer Prize winning grifter. So I imagine she can reinvent herself and have something else going on. Maybe she can write, oh, I learned about Thomas Sowell. He's the great. And she starts grifting off Thomas Sowell simping. That could be her role in the future. Who knows? But the truth is, right? The truth is, these journalists are too rock bottom stupid, and we have to figure out a way to keep them alive somehow, I guess, right? And like Canada does with the needle, right? And if you do the needle, you can just, right? So maybe a lot of them will do that. I don't know, right? I don't know. I'm for the, by the way, because of that, right? Sorry. It's pretty dark, but what are you going to do with a lot of these people? I mean, honestly, what are you going to do, right? Who knows, right? I don't see any Bitcoiners signing up for that. I think Bitcoiners are so optimistic that it just doesn't really come around us. Now, I do not want anyone to feel like I would ever suggest that to them. Anyone who would need help, and I don't want anyone doing that, right? But it's going to be between UBI and that, right? Because they're not going to have a place. So I'm for UBI. I want, we got to help these people. We got to, right? No choice. We just don't need them to take the vaccine. Now, it's not just the news changing and new stories like a vax pass and new battlefronts, new arguments that will just change the nature of who's on which side, and the mix and the numbers and all that stuff. It's things like the demoralization right? This is Vivek Ramaswamy, who's going to be coming to Bitcoin 2023 in Miami. So Vivek Ramaswamy yesterday was talking about the U.S. enrollment, U.S. military enrollment, right? U.S. military enrollment. Vivek says the U.S. military suffered a staggering 25% enrollment deficit last year. This is not surprising. Young Americans do not want to risk their lives for a country they're taught to be ashamed of. And I would say it's not just they're taught to be ashamed of. I'd say it's a country that many of the people just, right? They just no longer believe in the, what did Jerome Powell say and what's going on Wall Street and what did the Atlantic say and all these institutions that have just been burned to the ground since COVID and in the years before, right? All these things that are breaking down, it's not going to stop, right? Like Biden is not exactly going to be a charismatic guy who reinvigorates all these institutions. I mean, he has actual Alzheimer's dementia walk. He walks like a dementia person. I mean, the shuffle is a sign of exactly how decrepit all of this stuff is. Are they going to fix it? I don't think so. All right. I don't think it's going to get any better. And when you look at things like military enrollment, right, you start to see that America doesn't have the same will to support everything that came before. There's a now huge appetite to just totally rethink what goes on in America and how they participate in the world, right? That's happening right now before our eyes. And that's a big change, right? That's a huge change. And if that wasn't enough, right? If that wasn't enough, the entire U.S. system is still built. Mega political nature of the U.S. system still goes back to what Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve do, right? It still goes back to that. And now you get people like in China. This is from Hu Jin. So Hu is a retired propagandist for the Chinese government, for sure. But he has one of the most, I guess you could say, or he's well known amongst foreign U.S. journalists and European journalists. Retired now, as I said, but still was able to create dialogue and interesting points of view for Westerners. He's very good at his job, I guess you could say, right? So he's definitely a propagandist and a journalist, but is able to come across somehow objective while also being on a team, right? So Who wrote the following, and this is in relation to the Chinese reaction to the proposed U.S. ban on Chinese buying U.S. property. So we have that in Canada. So Canada put in restrictions in Vancouver, folks buying real estate, right? That happened. I think. So Who says in reaction to this Reuters headline about a proposed U.S. ban on Chinese purchases of U.S. property, he says, and I think this is what you're starting to see more and more in China. This is a mega political force, right? Here it is. It would be really unwise for Chinese people to buy U.S. property in the future. The U.S. dollar and the U.S. dollar assets are overestimated. It is hard to say how far the collapse will be, but it's surely on its way. Let nature take its course and stop private investment in the United States. So Who is actually really influential in China, right? As I said, this is a guy who is journalist emeritus, I guess you can say, right? He is a lot like the Cy Hirsch, I guess. I mean, I'm just, saying that. I don't think he's broken any huge stories like Seymour Hirsch, but nevertheless, it carries a lot of weight when a guy like this talks. Japan, right? So in order for the U.S. to perpetuate the Japanese part of it, like what was fused during the Manhattan Project, right? Japanese-American symbiosis, right? Now, never forget one of the great moments of American history, right? It's not all bad in America's case, right? But we can't think like that, right? One of the most amazing things America ever did, ever in the history of the world, right? Go back to the end of World War II for a second, right? Now think of the world the minute that second atomic bomb hits, right? Boom. What's going on planet Earth? America is not just the strongest country in the world. It's the strongest country in the world with the largest delta against the number 2 country in the world that has ever existed in all of history. They stand alone as the only country with a nuclear bomb. Nobody else, right? The Russians haven't stolen it yet. So only America has it. They have had no casualties on domestic soil, really, other than Pearl Harbor, which was already 6 or 7 years earlier. So they have none of that, right? Entire manufacturing capacity, entire industrial capacity is at 100%. Europe is on its knees. The whole thing's been blown up, right? There's not much going on over there. England's done. France is done. They got to rebuild their country. That years, France, because they've been taken over by the Nazis. Germany was destroyed. Russia had so much. The Soviet Union had so much trouble with Germany, right? There's body parts all over the place. It's chaos. They're not going to do anything. China's got a revolution. They can't do anything, right? They got their Maoist thing going on, and America's just nuked Japan, right? So who's number two? There is no number two. It's America. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I think Canada has like the fourth largest navy in the world at the time, and it's not compared to the American Navy at the time, right? They can run over the entire planet at that point if they feel like it. Not only that, but the president of the United States at the time, Harry Truman, is unelected. And not only is he unelected, no one even knows who he is, right? No one has ever even heard of this guy, right? Because he only came in at the last of Franklin Roosevelt's elections. 5 elections Franklin Roosevelt had, right? So he came in at the last to be vice president. He only became a senator in his 50s, right? So Harry Truman only became a senator in his 50s, and now he's only like 58 or 60 or something like that as he's becoming president. And he was a no college education. He was a bankrupt clothing store owner at like 40, and just had a good couple of years. And then by the time he was 50, um, he became this household name. And all he did was check into military spending and wasting money in World War II. That's what gave him a very big profile. So you've got American generals around the world, right, running some of the biggest armies the planet has ever seen. You've got Patton in Berlin saying, I'm going to Moscow and I'm going to take it, right? And who can stop him, right? There's no army in the way. You got MacArthur over in Japan now saying, well, I can go to Beijing and take that, right? And neither of them really feel like they need to listen to the president because Franklin's dead, right? So you get Harry there, who is unelected, no mandate, and generals who now just want to conquer the world with the weapons to do it and the capacity to do it. And what happens? What happens? Well, Harry Truman institutes the Marshall Plan, which is really his plan. He just borrowed it from General Marshall, pays for the reconstruction of the world, 5 generals, right, gone, and allows everyone to stand back up. It's basically an amazing passage in the history of America where they decide to do something no one has ever seen before, which is pay to rebuild the people they've conquered and pay them a lot, right? They made everybody better off. They made Japan, gave everything Japan ever could have wanted. Japan won World War II in the end, right? Because they got what they wanted. Global markets. They didn't get cultural hegemony, but they got to do and make money and be happy and have a really wonderful station, right? I continue to Japan as the most civilized, wonderful place in the world to be and visit, and has a lot to teach the world on how to live together and get along and just be polite and thoughtful. And so from there on, right, America passes a sort of test in my mind, right? It passed a kind of test. But everything else that's come after means we have to keep fixing things. And now if you look at Japan, all that was done, right? The American system after that test still relied on the folks they rebuilt, like Germany and Japan, being part of this petrodollar system. Otherwise, the deal, right, it didn't work anymore. So Japan now, right, this is breaking news. Japan delivery failures highest since the global financial crisis. This is absolutely wild. This is from Gold Telegraph. The Bank of Japan is drying up liquidity after buying up everything, right? So the government's debt servicing costs could increase to 4.5 trillion yen between 2023 and 2026, to 29.8 trillion yen, assuming an interest rate of 1.6%. So look, the petrodollars got troubles, just like the Chinese say, just like we see coming out of Japan. What we can clearly see is the top-down structure and all the institutions, the marketing ploys, right? It's gotten right to the end. It's gotten to the end of the game. The game now is the Federal Reserve be a transparent policymaker. You've got to let the bank cartel make transparent policy, which means we do not live in anything like a free system, and the mega politics are really just the whims of experts and whoever else is close enough to the system. So the good news is we don't need logic. We don't need to argue things all over the place and, oh, it's this, and you spent too much money. Things are going to change because the tide is simply turning, and the capacity of the coordination required to keep the marketing machine of the US dollar going, with the military in line, with the energy industry in line, is simply too complex. The incentives do not line up anymore, and the thing can't stand. It cannot stand, especially when you get a guy like Joe Biden, who is supposed to be the one to rally the whole thing together. Now, you got Hunter going out and now suing more people about talking about the laptop that was stolen, but it might not have been his laptop, something that might not have been his or existed in the first place, using prosecutors that are friends with his dad, and really underlining that the American system is not what the mega politics and the marketing capacity of American psychological operations has told us, right? So the mega politics of it are people are just going to wake up, right? There's too much coordination required in a system that no longer incentivizes coordination, right? It simply doesn't connect. And because it doesn't connect, the battlefront now for World War III is all over the place. And it looks like the light is getting through. It looks like the light's getting through, right? We see it in markets. We're going to see it in energy. We're seeing it in the PSYOP knowledge, right, of just how much of it is a psychological operation. And people are going to keep walking away. People are going to keep abandoning it, right? And I think that means we win, guys. I think it's coming any day. What do we got here? What do we got here? Yeah, Bitcoin running everywhere, huh? Good morning, Justin. Hey, Punjabi Satoshi, what's up, my man? Morning, dude. An old talk radio guy used to say MSLSD. I don't know what that means. Miss LSD. What's up, Mick? Yeah, Rush was a lot of fun, huh? Old Rush stuff. He was a good guy. Fun time. I think it's a great idea. Limit the White House, put the Fed in charge, and save a few bucks. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Dang it, Robert. Now I cannot get Tom Sawyer out of my head. Yeah. Rush Limbaugh. Yeah. Morning, Hammersaw. Morning, Hammersaw. All right, team. That's all I got for today. Running around, Let me know how the connection came in today, and I think the audio sounded okay. I don't know. I didn't see any troubles. All right, team. See you tomorrow. Peace. Oh, okay. Called MSNBC MSLSD. I didn't know that, Boo Boo. I like that. That's funny. That is funny. Jared asks, where is the boat? We're in Martinique, Jared. We're in Martinique. We're in Martinique today. French Martinique. We're in Martinique. I saw Bud is in... Bud wrote on YouTube in the comments that he's in Trinidad. I will not be making it to Trinidad, but I will write him in the comments to let him know, because I didn't see him here this morning. All right. Peace, team.